big news this week was that the world, developed nations, including Australia, have all signed up with blank checks for a reparations fund. No, sorry, that's not what it's called, because that triggers people. No, it's now a loss and damages fund to be paid out to poorer countries, mostly affected by or responsible for climate change. This is all because of the COP27 meeting that took place this week. It's this has been something that's been pushed on developed nations for 3 decades now, and finally at the COP27 meeting in Egypt, it was agreed to. Now, fun fact, this was first suggested by Vanuatu in 1991. Well, what is it? In a nutshell, under the proposal, developing nations could expect about US $2 trillion per year from countries like the UK and the US and Australia, as well as international financial institutions, as a form of climate change reparations, where developing nations would be granted the money when they suffer climate disasters like fires, floods, droughts, or famines. In theory, not a bad idea, and I like it. In theory. But why do I, as many other people who are following the bouncy ball of what's going on here, see the problem with it? The problem is that the world leaders, including Australia's currently elect government, have all blindly signed into this agreement, without knowing all the details. It's not clear which countries will pay, how they will pay, how much they will pay, and it's also not clear which countries will receive the money and when. There is debate around countries such as China and Saudi Arabia, the world's largest greenhouse gas polluter in China and the world's largest exporter of oil, Saudi Arabia, which are classified as developing nations, even though China has hosted 2 Olympic Games and has a space station. Little thing up in space that most countries, especially developing nations, don't have. Now, for the records, and for those just tuning in, I'm not a climate skeptic or denier, or I 100% believe climate change is a thing. Should we do something about it? 100% agree. Do I believe it's being catastrophized to weaponize and initiate a global transfer of money for other people to get rich off? Also, yes. It's a confusing place living inside my head. Should we be careful about how we transition and not rush into it the way we have been? Again, yes. But back to COP27 and this new loss and damage fund. Here is where we stand as Australians on this. The Albanese government supports the loss and damage fund. Good move. Australia's climate change minister, Chris Bowen, was around the negotiating table, and Australia has agreed to the fund. Also, potentially a good move. This is where it gets bad. We don't know how much Australia will pay to the fund annually, but experts are predicting that it'll be in the billions of dollars each year, potentially $54 billion each year to be exact. Based on the previous contribution Australia was asked to make of 2.7% to a $100 billion climate fund. 2.7 of 2 trillion is 54 billion. And we will also be potentially contributing to this because the Labor government is hoping to host COP31 in 2026. Now, here's where it's kind of a kick in the teeth for Australian people. It was only a few months ago after the federal election that we were being told by the federal treasurer, Jim Chalmers, when he handed down the budget, that it would be a bread and butter budget and not a flashy affair because there's no extra money to spend. We're over $1 trillion in debt, and Labor said that when they came to power, we had nothing to show but huge debt. Here's what Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers had to say.
And I think we've been pretty upfront about that in saying, well, that's how we've demonstrated that budgets can be about restraint and trimming spending and sensible tax reform. And whether there's 2 more budgets in the life of this parliament or 3 more budgets in the life of this parliament, I think people should expect the same kind of combination in the budgets that we're yet to hand down, as we saw in the budget yesterday.
Yet somehow, with all that spending restraint, we're able to sign a blank cheque to the UN when they ask. Let's not forget this loss and damages fund that was signed, well, that we've signed a blank cheque to, goes to support those in developing nations who suffer climate disasters like fire, floods, droughts and famines, which again I support in theory. But what about the Australians who are suffering from floods here? We've only just had a massive flood in Australia wiping through Eugowra, where hundreds were evacuated last week after flash flooding swept through. Now, insurance companies, all crooks they are, they've reported to be abandoning these residents for an array of reasons to get out of paying out claims. And when asked where he was during the floods, the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison was at the time of natural disasters when he was Prime Minister. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had this to say.
Not to get off on a bad foot or a wrong foot or anything like that, but all through the election, one of your slogans was wasn't here to hold a hose. Where have you been, sir? It was said during the election multiple times. Like, where have you been last week?
I've been
overseas. I heard.
Yeah, I was representing Australia.
So
overseas.
yeah.
Don't you just hate it when something you say comes back to bite you in the butt? Although, in Albo's defence, he was overseas for work, and the issue with former PM ScoMo was that he was on holiday. But yeah, this is another example of Albo having to backtrack on something that he said. And you can hear it in his voice in the clip, until the man answers the question for him by saying, "I heard you were overseas." Did he have an answer? But to the issue with all of this, in the spirit of signing up to and giving out blank cheques for reparations of climate change, of which, in his own words, climate change is to blame for the floods, which he said in a media coverage back in July.
What we know is that Australia has always been subject of floods, of bushfires, but we know that the science told us that if we continued to not take action globally on climate change, then these events, extreme weather events, would be more often and more intense. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that play out.
I hope Australians get a blank cheque too, just to be fair. And from what I understand, there will be funds made available to local residents affected by floods. But let's just watch this space and see how blank or restrictive the cheque is that we give our own people. There's just going to be a lot of blank cheques being written going forward. But back to COP27. If you look at CO2 emissions from the UK since 1750, we're talking the great industrial revolution here that has attributed to the beginning of the effects of climate change on the planet as the big polluting era. And as industrial cities began pumping out vast quantities of pollution into the atmosphere, well, here's an interesting fact. China has emitted as much CO2 since 2013 to today as UK has done since 1750 to today. And 63% of all current carbon emissions come from developing nations. This might be why the European Union and the US have demanded that China, remember they are classified as a developing nation, who could benefit from the $2 trillion annual fund. Well, they're asking that China really contribute to the fund rather than benefit from it. But China have said that they are not ready to agree to it. And of course they wouldn't. They're not idiots. They are the biggest polluter in the world, and they will continue to do for years and years to come, whilst the rest of the planet, the developing nation, all go for net zero. Another fun fact, the CO2 that Australia produces in 1 year, China pollutes in 15 days. Let that sink in next time there is a climate protest attacking Australia for our global pollution contribution. Now, being an opinion-based show, back to the Loss and Damage Fund, I have to tell you, I am torn on this one. Yes, I agree. Something needs to be done on the global stage to help developing nations with the effects of climate change. Also, something needs to be done to bring them up to date with technology so they can combat climate change. But we need more detail about this fund. And it should also not come at the expense of helping our own, just so that the government can look good in front of others on the world stage. The Australian people deserve more detail, along with safeguards and checks and balances to ensure that any money that we give out in a blank cheque is spent wisely and not rorted, lining corrupt pockets. So where we stand as it is, this decision by COP27 is a bad idea. But as always, with more information, my opinion is subject to change. Indeed it is.
The Troy Murphy Show.